Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F-words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
This is an ad by Regain Couples Therapy and features real testimonials.
This was our first time trying therapy, and honestly, it was long overdue. Looking back, we just wish we had started sooner.
Regain's qualified therapists help couples when they can't get there on their own.
We thought it was intimacy issues, but Andrea helped us uncover a deeper root cause we hadn't even realized was there.
Visit regain.com/couplespod to get 10% off your first month. Regain, powered by BetterHelp.
Hey friends, I'm Jonathan Smith, and this is Jump In with Jonathan, the podcast that makes you think, smile, and take action. Are you ready to jump in this show with me? Let's go.
We'll be in Hebrews chapter number 10. We'll be in verses number 24 through 25, 23 through 25 tonight. So go ahead and turn with me now to Hebrews chapter 10, starting in verse number 23. All right. So we'll get started here with this first verse. So it says here in verse number 23, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. For he who promised is faithful, and let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembly of ourselves together, as in the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the other as you see the day approaching." So that's verses 23 through 25 right there. If you look back at verse number 23, I like this first part that it mentions here. We'll kind of read that again. It says, "Let us hold fast the confession of our hope." So when you start there and you think of that, the word confession is really what you should be focusing on when you first read that, because when it's talking there, it's not it's not a confession as in like, oh, you've done something bad or something, that you're ashamed of, or in that manner. It's actually just saying your profession or your confession of faith is what it's talking about. It's not, it's not saying that, you're talking about what you've done bad. It's talking about, you are proclaiming what your hope is and where your faith is, and that's what this verse is getting at to start with. And then you get to the second part, and it says, "Without wavering, for he who promised is faithful." Of course, we know the he is Jesus, is saying that he is faithful, being the provider, being the one that's where our hope is, and that's why we get that first part of the confession, and then we get the second part of "for he who promised is faithful." So tonight, the theme I'll be on tonight is encouragement and being one, and being encouraging to one another as Christians, and just uplifting each other in the church, uplifting fellow Christians, and of course, being a good witness. So, and I think a lot of that starts with encouragement. And tonight, I think that the first verse there, verse number 23, it kind of is a good reminder of looking at, okay, this is what my faith is grounded in. And that's kind of where you start, is saying, okay, this is what I believe, and this is why I believe it. Because you get that first and second part that go together. verse number 24, when we get into that, and it says, "And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works." I think that considering one another, especially when it comes to encouragement, is one of the things I would really like to get at, because I think that it's important that we do encourage others. It's important that we think of others, and that we try and make it a priority that we not just look at ourselves and look at the things that we feel like. And I think it's not just personally, it can be just in our own church. I think a lot of times we get caught up in only focusing on what's going on here, but you start to think about, I think back to last week, and I think of our revival service that we had. And, I will say this, I said it on Sunday, but I'll say it again, is, if you missed our revival services last week, I feel like, you missed a major blessing. Brother Stephen Cox is a, tremendous preacher, and we had great singing every single night. We just had so much good service with the singing and the worship. And I think that it kind of made me think about, you think of when we have preachers or singers and all come to the church for these revivals, you think about tonight, those people. Brother Stephen is preaching down there in South Carolina. I think of, my dad preaching in Florida tonight as the youth minister at our church down there. And you start thinking about, all the people that whether it's, your family's church or your friend's church or somewhere else. And I think it's a little bit encouraging to think that way and think about tonight, that all around there's so many people that are worshiping, and we're doing the same thing. And so many times, we just get caught up in ourselves that we forget to look around and say, hey, Brother Stephen, he's down there preaching tonight. Or, the Joneses, Andrew and Mary Beth, I don't know if they're singing tonight, but you start thinking about that. And, like I said, I think about preachers at home, whether it's, close by where I'm from or down in South Florida, Central Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, just all across. I feel like we all know somebody. And I think it's encouraging when you think about that and you say, wow, it's so much bigger than just us. And so many times we forget that because we just come here. And sometimes it can be discouraging when we look around and we don't see a lot of people and we don't see, the pews full. But it's encouraging to remember, what our brothers and sisters in Christ are doing and what they're out there, and, that they're preaching the word, and that, there are good things happening. And I think it's important that we look at the good things happening around us. And that starts with encouragement, because I think, and for me personally, that's encouragement to me, that, you can look around and say, hey, there's churches around, there's churches here, there's people who've been in our church that have came to visit, that they're preaching the word and continuing that on. And that's why verse number 24 here in Hebrews chapter number 10, and it says, let us consider one another in order to stir up good works, to stir up love and good works. And I think that the considering one another is what kind of adds to that I'm talking about, is because when we consider one another, it also allows us to look at the needs of others, because we see, okay, this is where, I may be having this struggle, and someone else may be having something completely different, but we don't know until we find out, or until we take the time to ask somebody, hey, what are you going through? And that's why we ask at the beginning of our Wednesday night services, what prayer requests do we have? What praise reports do we have? Because we don't know those things until we ask, and until we take the initiative and the time to, kind of take the focus off ourselves and put it on the people around us. And I think that that's important. And, you think about just the name of our church here, Community Baptist Church. And, I've heard Jonathan say this. I've heard Brother Stephen say this last week. That's a community. That's a group. That's a group of people. That's not just, one or two or three people. Community is, people coming together and being united. And I think that it's important that we all work together with that same goal, and that we all remember that it's important to check on those around us. It's important to find out, what can we do, where are the needs at, and continuing that, and not just saying, well, I'm going to leave that for the next person. And that makes me think tonight of the term, I don't have to, or we don't have to. So many times, I think you'll hear people say, well, I don't have to do that, we don't have to do that. And sometimes it can be, it can be in traditional things. People say, well, we don't have to do this. It's not required of us. And that can be just when it comes to church. I think of like tonight, Wednesday night. A lot of people say, well, I don't have to come on Wednesday night. Well, you don't. I mean, there's not a you have to do it, but you should want to do it. And I think that that's the important thing, is that, you should want to be here. You should want to, encourage others. You should want to take the time, because it's going to bring you up. It's going to help you when you're here and you're amongst fellow believers. And in verse number 25, it kind of gets to that. It says, not forsaking assembling ourselves together as in the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. So you get to that first part. It says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together. And that's kind of what we see as we look around, and we see that there's just not a lot of people that are assembling. And I think that it's because we've kind of gotten that statement of, oh, I don't have to, we don't have to. And if we have that approach, then how can we expect others to have any different approach? If I don't have to, well, then they're going to say the same thing. Well, we don't have to.
From a meeting at the office to a big first date, there's a lot of pressure to wear the right clothes for every event. But clothes don't make the man. So why stuff your closet with things that only work for some situations? With Mack Weldon, you can build a wardrobe that looks polished in any setting. Their clothing is understated and tells the world that you stay you wherever you go. They craft each piece by combining timeless style and modern performance materials, so you can stay looking good and feeling comfortable from morning to evening. No wardrobe changes required. Browse everything from summer-ready tech linen shorts and anti-odor polos to tailored sweats and crews for a night in. They can outfit you for anything, no matter what's on your agenda for the day. Go to MackWeldon.com and get 25% off your first order of $125 or more with promo code MACK25. That's MackWeldon.com. Promo code MACK25.
This is an ad by Regain Couples Therapy and features real testimonials.
This was our first time trying therapy, and honestly, it was long overdue. Looking back, we just wish we had started sooner.
Regain's qualified therapists help couples when they can't get there on their own.
We thought it was intimacy issues, but Andrea helped us uncover a deeper root cause we hadn't even realized was there.
Visit regain.com/couplespod to get 10% off your first month. Regain, powered by BetterHelp.
If I say, hey, I don't have to come on Wednesday night, or I don't have to, I don't have to give money to outreach, I don't have to do these things, well, then how can we expect others to do anything different? Because that gives them the out of, hey, well, I don't have to be there if you don't, and people, we do what others do. We're kind of, it's human nature that we kind of follow what each other do, and sometimes that's a good thing and sometimes that's a bad thing. But in the church, it should be a good thing, because we should be, looking at this example of Christ, and that should kind of be the guidance and the guideline for how we should be living and how we should be going about our lives. But so many times, we just kind of go with everyone around us. We look at what they're doing, and it's like, okay, well, they're doing this, so I think, I'm going to do that. And sometimes, I can think in my own life, sometimes you get in situations where you just don't really know what to do. You're new to something. It can be at work. You're completely new to something, and, when you're young or you're just starting out doing that, you're like, okay, well, I'm going to do what they do. And sometimes that doesn't really work out for you. And I think that, we see too many times that it just seems like everyone else is just following what the people and what the world around them are doing. But it kind of starts with us. And, Brother Stephen, he made a good point last week, and this has kind of stuck with me from last week is, he was talking about civilian life and the difference between being a civilian and being a soldier, and talking about being a soldier for Christ. And I like, he really got into that and broke it down of, you're no longer supposed to be, so entrenched in civilian life because you're a soldier for Christ. And I think that's kind of how people get to this point, is the fact that, we look tonight, I'm sure all of us on our way here, saw plenty of cars at people's houses. We see plenty of people at restaurants and at gas stations and at all these places. And it just seems like, everyone's kind of just going along with the motions, and everyone's doing what they do. And, there's some people who may seem happy, some of them aren't, but it just seems like people just go along with whatever. And I think that, these verses here in verse number 25, it's saying, don't forsake assembling together, as is the manner of some. And I think that as the manner of some, that's what we see, is there's plenty of people who, it's just so much easier. Well, I can just stay home tonight because, there's not a lot of people going. It's like, it doesn't really matter how many people were here. And I think Brother Stephen did a good job of, talking about that point. He was just saying of, hey, you're no longer supposed to be a civilian because, we're soldiers for Christ. And when I think of that, it kind of takes me back to that first verse. And when it's talking about, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering. When I think of kind of an army and of soldiers, I kind of think about, can you imagine if our country's army or any country's army, if there was conflict from within, how could they go to battle against anyone else? And it seems like for us as Christians, there's so much conflict because, like I say, we can not only just focus on ourselves, but what happens is when we do focus on other churches, sometimes that can be a conflict. Because, we're kind of battling amongst ourselves. Who has the most people? Or how does, this person's preacher present things versus how our preacher presents things. It's like, we get caught up in all these little things. And, you hear it said so often. Mike was talking about this in Sunday school this past week. He was talking about if we change the color of the walls and how, that could be a conflict to somebody. And we get in these things, and it's like, well, if we are so much in conflict with each other, how can we be a strong army to go to battle against anybody? We can't go fight anybody if we're, not united, and if we're not together, if we're, just all apart and we're not really building each other up. And I think that it's important to remember that and be mindful of that. And that's why this verse is saying here, to not forsake assembling ourselves together, as in the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. And of course, what we see in the end of this verse, it says, but exhorting one another. So that's talking about encouragement. It's talking about encouraging one another, lifting each other up, and not tearing each other down, and not acting like, well, anyone outside of here is the enemy, because that's not the case. We have a mission, and like Brother Stephen said, we're in a true battle. I mean, there's real bullets flying. There's things happening. There's people being torn down. There's the devil's at work. But at the same time, it's not us against fellow Christians. It's us against, the lost world that we're going out against. And we have to be the ones that kind of get it together before we can go to battle, and so that we can be effective, out on the battlefield. And I think that, you see that even in sports. You see, I think of, I'm from Florida, the Florida Gators. One of the issues that they've had this off season is that the players in practice, so many of them have gotten injured in practice that they don't make it to game week. And this past week, there were like 7-8 players that missed the first game of the season because, they were going so hard against each other in practice, they didn't make it to the big show. So I think that, that's another kind of way to look at it is, if we're injuring each other and we're tearing each other down, we're not going to make it to the big game, and we're not going to make it on the field to go out and perform. So I think that it's important just to keep that in mind and to really think about that, and think about that. When you're having trouble with someone, or when you don't like how something's going, speak up, mention the things, and I think that's one good thing is, Jonathan, is a great leader for us because he believes firmly in that. He encourages us, hey, let's talk about this, let's figure it out together. And I think that, we're very fortunate to have, a leader like that says, hey, let's talk about this, let's figure it out before we really, go at each other, and then, everyone's kind of separated and apart. It's important that we go ahead and figure this all out. So go with me now. We're going to turn to Luke chapter number 6. We'll go over there for just a few minutes here. So Luke chapter number 6. So what we see here in Luke, so it's talking about in the second half of Luke, let's see, it talks about building on the rock. Verse number 46 is where we'll be in Luke chapter number 6 here. So it talks about, verse 46 says, "But why do you call me Lord and not do the things which I say? Whoever comes to me and hears my sayings and does them, I will show you whom he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation on the rock. And when the flood arose, the stream beat vehemently against the house and could not shake it, for it was founded on the rock." So tonight I kind of started on that point of, our foundation and what we build here. And it kind of starts with the foundation because, as we know, a lot of us are into building and construction and into, working on things. And we know that anything that you're building, no matter what it is, whether it's house, car, whatever, lawnmower, you're building anything, you got to have a good foundation for what you're working with. And I think that these verses kind of tell us that, and we hear that so much, and I think that we've all kind of heard these verses, but it's just important to really take into consideration what these verses are saying. And I think that what it's saying is it's saying, what is your foundation built on? And it's giving the example of, well, when a storm comes, because you may read that at first and say, well, the house that's built on sand is not as strong as the house on rock. But it's not just about the foundation.
Warning, the following ZipRecruiter radio spot you are about to hear is going to be filled with F words.
When you're hiring, we at ZipRecruiter know you can feel frustrated, forlorn even, like your efforts are futile, and you can spend a fortune trying to find fabulous people, only to get flooded with candidates who are just fine. Fortunately, ZipRecruiter figured out how to fix all that. And right now, you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ZipRecruiter.com/zip. With ZipRecruiter, you can forget your frustrations because we find the right people for your roles fast, which is our absolute favorite F word. In fact, 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day.
Fantastic!
So, whether you need to hire 4, 40, or 400 people, get ready to meet first-rate talent. Just go to ZipRecruiter.com/zip to try ZipRecruiter for free. Don't forget, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip. Finally, that's ZipRecruiter.com/zip.
Your kids could get free or low-cost health coverage from Medicaid or CHIP. Even if you've applied before, they may be eligible now. Kids up to age 19 are covered for checkups, vaccines, dentist visits, hospital care, and more. And if they already have Medicaid or CHIP, remember to renew every year. Visit insurekidsnow.gov or call 877-KIDS-NOW. Paid for by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
It's about the reason why you need the solid foundation, because you need the solid foundation for when a storm comes, because it's all fine, when it's a night like tonight and the sun's out and we've all been talking about, it's, starting to feel a little cooler. It feels good outside, everybody's happy, everybody's good, but it's like, okay, well, the weather may heat up, there may be storms come. It's like, okay, well, that's when you need to know what your foundation's built of. That's when it matters. And we've seen, that things can happen. All kinds of storms can come. There's all different things. And, it can even be just snow and ice that, maybe we don't think about those things in the summertime, but then, you get into winter and it's like those things become real again. Sometimes it's kind of hard to think, when it's hot and you're sweating and you're saying, man, I just can't wait for fall. I can't wait for winter. You forget all about, dripping your pipes and, making sure you have salt, making sure the road's salted in your driveway or your neighborhood or whatever. And it's like, those are real things that we have to prepare for. And a lot of times I think that that's another thing, is that we don't really prepare properly. We just kind of put it off. And that's just human nature too, that we don't prepare because we say, I'll worry about it when that comes around, or, when I get time, because that's another thing too, is it's always, well, when I get time. It's like, for me personally, if I say, well, when I get time, I don't know, I may have the time to do it, but that kind of sounds like to me, well, I may not do it. So, it sounds like it's pretty important, if you're saying that, it's a good idea, to go on and do it, or be planning in that direction. And that kind of goes back to that I was talking about, the I don't have to, or the we don't have to. There again, you could say, well, I don't have to do that. It's not time. There's no snow. There's no ice. But, you realize that those things are going to come. It just may not be today and it may not be tomorrow, but there's a thing, and that's kind of how in Scripture, it's kind of giving us the same advice. It's saying that, the storm may not be today, but the storm may be tomorrow. Or when it comes to encouragement, the end of those verses in Hebrews chapter number 10, verse number 26, is saying there at the end that, you're preparing for the day. And of course, the day is the day of the coming of Christ. And I think that that's kind of what we're building towards. And sometimes, that gets out of sight because, as Christians, you kind of think, well, I'm focused on today, I'm saved, whatever. But it's like, we still have to focus on that as well. We're not exempt from that. We should be looking towards the future and looking towards, the coming of Christ again. And I think that here, if you jump over to Luke chapter number 5, we'll go back there a minute. Let's see. Chapter number 5, starting in verse number 1. So it talks about the 4 fishermen called as disciples. So here, I'll just read a little bit of this passage. So it was, as the multitude pressed about him to hear the word of God, that he stood by the lake of Gennesaret, which that's also, as you know, this is where they're out on the boat. And, of course, they're the fishermen, and their nets, they're not really catching anything. And it says here, and saw 2 boats standing by the lake, but the fishermen had gone from them and were washing their nets. Then he got into one of the boats, which was Simon's, and asked him to put out a little from the land. And he sat down and taught the multitudes from the boat. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, launch out into the deep and let your nets for a catch. But Simon answered and said to him, Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net. And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both the boats so that they began to sink. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord. For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid, from now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. These verses here kind of tie everything together of the passages over there in Hebrews and the passages in chapter number 6 that we read tonight of building on the solid foundation, encouraging others, and now it kind of goes to the fact of sometimes, that's us. We look around and we may say, hey, we don't have a lot in our nets right now. We're not catching a whole lot, but we still have to keep on doing what we're doing. We have to press on, because here the scripture shows us, they're out there all day, all night, and it's saying, that the disciples say to Jesus, hey, we haven't caught anything. And he's still like, hey, come with me, cast your net into the deep end, try something different, and, we'll do it. And it's kind of, they look to him for guidance, and that's what we have to do. We have to do the same. We have to look to Jesus for all of our guidance, for all of our navigation of everything that we do, because that's the situations we find ourselves in. We find ourselves in these places where, we kind of say, well, I'm not catching anything right now. And I think, I like to fish, and it kind of, these scriptures take me back to, with a friend of mine, we were on a lake down in Florida, and in the way that it is there, one of the sides is pretty marshy, and then the other is kind of like the main part of the lake, and it's just smooth water, nothing there. And I remember we started out fishing one morning. We were at my friend's bachelor party is what it was for. We were down there at their lake place, and we were fishing, and that one side, towards the lake side, we weren't catching anything, but, we turn around and we go over towards that marsh side and we start reeling them in. And it's like, it's a whole different feeling. And sometimes, that's what it is. We just got to do things maybe just a little different. And that doesn't mean, change everything, because I think that sometimes it's easy to say, well, we need to just change everything. We need to repaint the walls. We need to change the carpet. We need to change the doors and the music and, how we dress and how we look and everything. It's like, maybe not. And that doesn't mean, stay the same either. There's a balance to that. And, we can't let those things override everything either, because, we can't start making tradition, religion or making that the main thing, because it's not about tradition. It's about, the solid foundation. It's about, believing that, that things can change and things can be different. And it kind of makes me think back. We had Brother Frank Shelton here, and, I love Brother Frank, and I think that, one of the things that'll stick with me that he said is, he uses that phrase, and I think about this so often because, it's relevant in my life and it's relevant in all of our lives. He uses that phrase, the king's got one more move, and it's so important to remember that. And he says too, I was thinking back to this, and, he says that when you are down to nothing, God is up to something. And I think that we see that here in this set of scriptures in Luke chapter number 5, is that, they're not catching anything. And it's like, God shows up, Jesus is there with them and says, hey, let's cast out into deep water. Let's do something a little different. Here's what I'm encouraging you to do. And everything changes. And then they're going back to shore, showing everybody, hey, we're leaving here with a full net today. And it's like, how did that happen? It's like that happens through God, and that's what he did here. And this week, I was thinking about one of my friends. I was mentioning to you tonight of pastors and preachers and encouragement of others around you and those that you see. And one of the pastors that I grew up going to church camp with and hearing him preach at our camp down in Georgia that we went to every year, I saw an article this week that a Christian news outlet, which if you know me, I'm into journalism and public relations and social media management, media, and I do it on in motorsports and in racing primarily, and travel and other things. But this was a Christian news outlet had gone to Brother Tim Oliver and was talking to him about his ministry that he does with college students down in Milledgeville, Georgia. And it kind of was encouraging to me because I talk about encouragement tonight. So in the article, I was looking here in my notes, and it was talking about how last Monday, so sometimes people, I was thinking, sometimes people, when they tell something, especially, an evangelist or a Bible preacher, they'll mention like, a celebrity, I remember that this happened at this person's church or to this person or that. But now keep in mind, this is someone I know personally and someone that, that is just a regular, everyday person like you and I. Just last Monday, he had 118 college students at his house that he has a Bible study and a worship time down in Georgia, and 118 college students were down at his place. And it's so encouraging whenever I see Brother Tim. He posts the videos all the time on Facebook of the students being there and having dinner and worshiping together and having these things. And it's you look at that and it's like, wow, there's so many things of the news and so much bad that goes on around us that we get caught up in that. But it's like, we need to share more of the good news, whether it's the gospel or just what's happening in our church or what's happening in the churches around us or in the lives of others. It's important, like I say, that we speak up and that we say, hey, that's why we have praise reports. That's why we say that, so we know, hey, this is what God's done here. This is what God's doing in the church down the road or in the next state. And this really covered that. And the one thing that I found in this that was interesting to me is you go down a little further in the article, and as a journalist, it's important to do that because sometimes, you got to have your hook and your grabber at the beginning to get people's attention, but then you got to keep on reading because, the story sometimes changes. And it said in the article that in 2020, they were down to one student. So he had this big group. He said that, in 2020, of course, the whole world changed, and it seemed like that ministry kind of went down. And he said that there was a prayer walk at the university there, Georgia State College and University, GSCU in Milledgeville, Georgia, that the students got together with the Baptist Collegiate Ministry. And it said that within 2 weeks, they grew back to 30 people. And it's only grown since then. And now, just last Monday, they had 118 students that were taking part in this. And, so many times we kind of wonder, well, is it necessary to do something like that? Is that something we should put our time and effort into? And it's like there's all kinds of ministries and different people in different places have different, resources and different things available. But I think that it's just the idea of keeping the faith and having a firm foundation, believing, that God can fill these pews just like, he worked in that ministry to bring 118 people when in 2020 it was down to one. And that was just an encouragement to me. And I think about that and it's like, wow, that's great. And there's so many stories like that, but we don't really hear that. We hear the news and we turn it on. Sometimes the local news, they highlight some good stories. I will say here, sometimes I'm impressed. They mention good and they mention things, but it seems like, then the national news comes on and you get that real dramatic music and it's like, okay, well, that's time to get the remote and turn it off, It's like you hear that music come on and, like I say, as a journalist, that they're trying to build the scene. They're trying to create an emotion and try and get you all worried and stirred up because you're like, oh my gosh. And, they'll have those tickers at the bottom, breaking news and, all these things. And it's like, okay, let's just keep it simple. I want to know what's happening to my neighbors. I want to know what's happening to the people around me, what's happening in our church and what's happening to other churches. And, we should use that as encouragement, and that should be really what we're proclaiming because it's important. And that's kind of what I think of tonight when I think of encouragement. And the article, they closed out with this, and this was from Brother Tim, and I thought, what a great quote. A lot of times in press releases, I quote race car drivers, but this, like I say, a Christian news outlet, they were interviewing a pastor, and they quoted him, and he said, "Feed them and they will come, love them and they will stay, introduce them to Jesus and they'll be with you forever." And I thought, wow, what a great quote, and what a great thing that's getting put out in the media. And of course, that was shared by so many people in his church, and so many people that I went to camp with from Florida that know Brother Tim and his family. And it's like, wow, that's just one example. But if that's not encouraging, I don't know what is. And it's like, that's the kind of news that we need to hear. And it kind of takes us back to what it's saying in Hebrews. If you turn back with me real quick, as we're kind of losing time tonight, Hebrews chapter number 10, we'll go back there. And it says here in verse number 25, "Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching." So really, the main idea tonight is that we should be encouraging one another, that we should be lifting each other up, and that if we're going to be united, and if we're going to be able to preach the gospel or to share any sort of message with people, just a message of encouragement, if we, like I say, are battling amongst ourselves, or if we don't have it right, then we can't go out and do that. And I would say this tonight, we may not have, a full crowd, but one thing I will say is there's a lot of eyes on us, because everybody on the outside is looking for us to slip up. They're looking for you to make a mistake. They're looking at, how do you do things? What are you doing? And it's like, we don't know. There's so many people out there that are, they're focused on that. And so it's important to not forget that there's a lot of eyes on us, and they're checking on what are we doing, what are we saying. And they're looking for that, those weaknesses. And it's like, okay, we've got to be strong, and we've got to, prepare the same and, preach the same messages that we would if the church were full, or whether there's 5 or 6 people. It doesn't really matter. It's the same thing. The mission's the same. And I think that it's important. And, like I say, I'm thankful that we have that. We have a pastor in Jonathan that he does that. And, we're very fortunate and blessed that we've had, good crowds, and that we're growing. And, it's because we've stayed faithful, and because we've stayed believing that, more people are going to come, and we've encouraged people and shared the gospel, and we're going to continue doing that. So I say, to you tonight is just, let's keep doing what we're doing, and let's keep encouraging one another, because I think we do a good job of that here. We're a close group, and it's important, to stay close and to encourage others and let people know the messages you hear. And that's why it's great that we have social media, that, we can tell somebody, before maybe we told them about what the pastor said, or maybe we told them, well, this is the scriptures it came from. But now, we have the technology that we can say, hey, go back and listen to Revival last week. Go listen to what Brother Stephen said. Go listen to what Brother Frank said. Go listen to what Jonathan said last week. And it's like, it's so great. And I think, that's why I really can say it's great that I mention a lot of these sermons and these people tonight. And even though if you never heard them, you can go back, and that's what it's there for. So I'll kind of close with that tonight. And, I'm glad that, we have that ability, and that we're able to encourage one another that way. So it's been a good study here in Hebrews chapter number 10 tonight. So we'll go ahead and close out. Brother Johnny, if you'll close us out tonight. Amen.
Thank you for listening to today's episode on Jump In with Jonathan. And keep in mind that life is better when you jump in. Have a blessed day.